My name is Vanessa Böse. I'm an assistant professor at the Varieties of Democracy, or the V-Dem Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And Staffan Lindberg and I, we host this conference together, and we will be leading you through these sessions. Over the next 1.5 days, we will make the case for democracy, and we will study what science can tell us about the effects of democracy on a range of socioeconomic outcomes. So, for example, education or economic growth, or even climate change mitigation strategies. But before we start and jump right into the conference, I want to make two important points. First of all, the main goal of this conference is to increase and to generate a great dialogue between, on the one hand, academics and scholars, and on the other hand, policymakers and practitioners. So our main goal is to make this an interactive event. And as you can see, we have speakers and participants both on site in Brussels and virtually. And for those of you who are participating virtually, we have created a question and answer, a Q&A tool that you'll see in your Zoom bar below the Zoom screen. So please post your questions there. And using that Q&A tool, you can also upvote questions from other participants that you find very interesting. But please do not use the chat to pose questions, because we will focus only on those questions that are asked through the Q&A tool. Now, for those of you who are participating in Brussels on-site, please raise your hand if you have questions, and our on-site team will make sure that you'll get a microphone and you'll get a chance to speak and ask your question. Now, we have also created hashtags that you see on the screen and in the Zoom chat. Now, my colleague is posting them. They're hashtag case for democracy and hashtag C4D. Feel free to use them. Feel free to tweet about the conference, give us your feedback, comment on the conference, go crazy with it. Now, my second point that I want to make is to extend a big thank you. First of all, this conference is funded by the European Union, so our first thank you goes out to Laura Bertea and Tom Miller, who've worked very hard to make this possible. And second, I want to thank my team or our team at the Varieties of Democracy Institute, both on site and in Gothenburg. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Staffan Lindberg, our V-Dem director, who's on site in Brussels and will take over from here.
Thank you, Vanessa, and a big warm welcome to all of you who are here on site, despite the challenges, and thank you for also adhering to all these extra precautions. I normally wear a mask when I move around, but up here on the stage, we're allowed to take it off when we speak. All of you have agreed to the extra COVID regulations. We're very grateful for that. We're also very grateful and welcome everyone who is participating online. We have over 400 registered participants for these 1.5 days. So we're just a little bit sad that not more of you could be here with us today. We're grateful, naturally, especially grateful for the participants who are here and virtually from the European Union, and also to all of you who are from organizations across the world. I think I counted to 5 continents looking at the registry, and organizations, diplomatic missions, and so on. So we're very grateful for that, and we think it's wonderful to see so many here for this important event. And not the least, of course, thank you to the speakers who agreed to come and share your wisdom and your knowledge and your expertise with all of us here and everybody who is attending virtually. Many of the speakers, you've made it here to be here on site despite the challenges. Others are going to be attending virtually, but we are equally grateful to all of you. Now, this opening has also faced some challenges, some that have nothing to do with COVID, but with democracy actually happening in Sweden. So for those of you who are not sort of following Sweden on a day-to-day basis and the politics there, we had a new government last week with our first female prime minister ever, after 100 years of female suffrage in Sweden. Almost on the day of that, we got our first prime minister. And then one of the parties in parliament turned around and didn't approve the budget. So she was only there for 7 hours. But now, as of today, she's been reinstated. So she's now prime minister and has presented her new government. But the minister of democracy and culture that was scheduled to be here and welcome us all today is no longer a minister, because that party is, the Green Party, is not part of the government. So a little bit of process. That means its opening is looking a bit different than it should be. Before coming back to the theme of the conference, I'd like to open up the floor to our colleague and good friend of V-Dem and V-Dem Institute at the Commission, Tom Miller, head of section for democracy at INPA at the Commission. So the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Stefan. And I'm very sorry that our director couldn't be here today, couldn't be with us. As you can see, this is more of a virtual conference to make sure it doesn't become a viral conference. So thank you very much for all being here. Look, I'm going to be brief. I think there's a lot of amazing speakers to come. And first of all, I just wanted to congratulate the people who've made this possible, the people who brought, who's been doing many years of research and who've been able to bring this research to a wide global audience. And of course, our friends in V-Dem, Stefan, Vanessa, and so on, have done a fantastic job, and we are absolutely delighted that we've been able to co-fund this initiative. I remember actually in March when I think we did the launch, and I see many familiar faces on the agenda, and I hope to see a few more today. I briefly talked about the death of fact, but of course, it's been given much more eloquent expression by the great Maria Ressa, who said, without facts, there is no truth. Without truth, there is no trust. And we've seen that and versions of that repeated many times over the past year and more. And of course, that is the way that democracy unravels. That is the way that society unravels. So today you'll hear the facts about democracy. I think it used to be a self-evident truth that democracy was a global good. Now the self-evident part is often questioned, but more importantly, the notion of truth itself seems to be up for grabs. But the truth is, democracy works. It stops people being poor. It makes them healthier. It makes society more equal, prevents wars, and it saves lives. So the conference isn't just about the facts that prove the value of democracy, but the value of the facts themselves. I think there can be few subjects more urgent and more important, and we're absolutely delighted to be part of that. So Stefan, Vanessa, the team at V-Dem, everyone, my colleague Laura, everyone who made this possible, fantastic. And I know what has been done over the past year and what is going to continue to be done has a huge shelf life. I know that colleagues within the EU, with the States, moving towards the Summit for Democracy, for example, the work that's being done and has been done is being quoted, being used, and being used to support the case. So fantastic work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom talked about, I think we could say that has been done, be no more
being quoted, being used, and being
timely
used to
and more.
So fantastic work.
Another moment
Thank you very much.
where
Thank you,
this sort of conference is more needed. As Tom talked about, I think we could say that
has been done,
be no
is being
more
quoted, being used, and being
timely
used to
and more.
So fantastic work.
Another moment
Thank you very much.
where
Thank
this
you,
sort of conference is more needed. As Tom talked about, I think we could say that
has been done,
be no
is being
more
quoted, being used, and being
timely
used
and Thank you. Sort of conference is more needed. As Tom talked about, I think we could say that
has been done.
a third of the world population live in countries that are right now undergoing negative change, either democracy sliding back or dictatorships becoming more authoritarian. That's 2.6 billion people. And those in particular who live in dictatorships or who are living in countries that are moving towards it or becoming worse dictatorships, those are the people that are directly affected by the consequences that we will talk about here over this conference. A lot of the top-notch research that you 2.6 billion people speakers have volunteered to come and share with us is about the dividends of democracy. Who live in how democracy and democratization leads to better outcomes. Moving towards it or but there is also a flip side to that, of course. Those are the people that are directly which is affected, increasingly apparent throughout the world. We will talk about here over this conference. A lot of in fact, top-notch research. When we look at the V-Dem data, we'll look at the level of democracy, freedom, and human rights that the average global citizen enjoy today. We are back to where we were in 1989, or even before the end of the Cold War. On a global scale, all those expansions of freedoms and rights and dignity that people came to enjoy after the end of the Cold War has been eradicated. That put things in perspective, I think. So, and we also face the challenge that we're going to hear about, I think also in the plenary, from the global barometers, and we have Joseph Asunka in the room from the Afrobarometer, that people are getting increasingly disappointed with how democracy delivers. And while that may be the case on the individual country level, it's important for us to take stock globally over longer time periods and gather the evidence, if it's there, and it is in many areas, that democracy actually has dividends and advantages, also in terms of all the areas that we'll hear about here today: economic growth and reducing poverty, education, empowering of women, peace and human security, environment and combating climate change, human development and global health, public goods provision, and fighting corruption. So I'm very grateful that we are all here, and I think it's time to move on to the first session that Vanessa will chair for us, and say thank you to Tom for coming here and welcoming everyone. And thank you again to the team behind this, and not the least Nazifa, who's worked so hard, and all of you speakers who are here to share your knowledge and expertise. Thank you so much. And on that note, let me hand it over to you, Vanessa, to take it off for the first session.
Thank you, Stefan. Yes, so in this first session, we bring together scientific evidence on the relationship between democracy and economic prosperity and economic growth. So who would be better to start the session off than James Robinson, and to tackle the big question, which is, does democracy really cause growth? James Robinson and has together with a number of co-authors a range of publications on the topics. And in all or in many of these publications, he relies on data. And just like Tom Miller said just now, there's no truth without facts. So a lot hinges on that data. So the next following two speakers in that session will take a closer look at the data that is used in these cross-country growth analyses. John Doses is our second speaker, and he'll discuss differences in data transparency and reliability between democratic and autocratic regimes and what the implications are for the study of democracy and growth. And aside from differences in data reliability and transparency, what is also important is that there might be different estimation techniques or different measures of democracy. So our third speaker looks at that, and our third speaker, Mario Maggioni, has conducted a meta-analysis. So he pretty much collates all the evidence from different kinds of studies using different approaches and tries to figure out across all these studies, is there something that we can say? And our last speaker will close the panel looking at the question, so if democracy really does cause growth, what is it about democracy that causes economic growth? So which building blocks are responsible? Which building blocks are the drivers that are pushing this democracy and growth nexus? So let's begin. Our first speaker, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be James Robinson. He's the director of the Pearson Institute at the Harris School of Public Policy, and he's professor of global studies at the University of Chicago. And he has worked extensively on the democracy growth relationship, but also more broadly on the general relationship between institutions and different aspects of prosperity. And today he will share his findings on his research on democracy and growth. We are very, very happy to have you on board, James, and we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Okay, terrific. Let me share my screen and get on with it. Full screen mode.
Yes.
Did that work? Yes. Okay, you can see that?
No, we still see the regular one.
You can't see the slides?
We see the slides, but not in full screen mode.
Oh, that's funny. They're full screen mode for me. How curious. Should I try? What's happening? Okay, so I try again?
Yeah, just try again. And I mean, if not, we can see the slides. I think that's
on with it. Yes. Okay, no better?
Nope, we still see the original one.
It's on full screen mode here. So shall I just start talking anyway?
Yes, start talking.
Okay, so I want to talk about my research on democracy and prosperity, and I want to start with some sort of intuitions about what's the connection. Why should there be a connection between democracy and prosperity? So democracy is a set of institutions that conditions the political process that is critical in determining what type of public policy outcomes you're going to get. And what we know is that to have prosperity, you need enormous amounts of investment in public goods that private individuals on their own are not going to have the correct incentives to provide. That's kind of basic public finance, infrastructure, healthcare, education, social insurance. The government needs to provide that environment for the private sector to thrive. Okay, so
James, sorry, I need to interrupt you. We only see the first slide. If you go back to your original file, yes, now we see the second, the third.
All right, so maybe I'll just stick like this.
Just use that, perfect.
Okay, sorry, it's probably one of those silly Zoom things, so I'd have to reboot my computer. Okay, good. So there's a political process. The political process is shaped by institutions. Think of a sort of stylized difference between a democracy and some sort of dictatorship. Okay, in a democracy, there's very different people who participate in that political process. Okay, and those people have interests in terms of the provision of public goods or in terms of the level of taxation. And I think the big difference between a democracy and a dictatorship is in a dictatorship, a much narrower set of people in society count in terms of determining public good provision or determining what the state does. And I think the basic intuition as to why you'd expect democracy to be good for prosperity is that public goods benefit the great mass of citizens. So how are you going to get the government to pay attention to those people? Well, the most straightforward way of thinking about that is if they have political power, if they have political voice, the government is going to have to pay attention to them. So then they're going to have to provide what they want, which is public goods, and that's what society needs for prosperity. So I think, if you think about the alternative in some sort of dictatorship, you have some subset of the population, whoever that is, they could provide public goods too, and sometimes they do. But you have to have it not through a process of accountability or voice. They don't provide those public goods because they're forced to by the citizens. They do it because they want to, for one of many reasons I can talk about. All right. So I think the basic idea of why you think democracy is critical for prosperity is that there isn't, what history suggests is there isn't a reliable way to get self-interested elites to provide things that are good collectively. What they want is things that are good for themselves. Okay, and let me give you an example of that, which comes from my own research in Zimbabwe. I was doing fieldwork in Zimbabwe in August 2017. So we were driving in Harare at night, and you can see it's pretty black. There's a lack of basic public goods light. Okay, and as we turned the corner, we turned into another road, and suddenly there was a strange difference, and you can see what the difference is. There's this road is completely black. This road, suddenly, miraculously, there's light. Okay, so I asked the taxi driver, what's going on here? What's this road? And it was the road to President Mugabe's residence. Okay, so here's an example of a dictatorship, basically, without putting too much complication on it, which provided goods for the interest of the rulers, but without accountability or voice. Most people don't get very much in Zimbabwe, as perhaps you know. Okay, so I'd like this example as a sort of visceral example of what goes wrong in a dictatorship typically. It could be that out of his own benevolence, President Mugabe wanted to provide light for everybody, but that didn't turn out quite that way. Okay, so the scientific research that has been referred to is my joint research with Daron Nashimolu, Suresh Naidu, and Pasquale Restrepo has sort of examined in detail the causal impact of democracy on economic growth. So of course, if you look around the world, you can see very fast that countries that are democratic tend to be rich countries, but you can't infer much from that about the effect of democracy on economic growth, because maybe the relationship is the other way around. Maybe the causality runs the other way around. Maybe just prosperity leads a country to become democratic. So that's something else which I've done a lot of research on, which turns out not to be true. But let me just sort of say there's a complicated scientific problem here in interpreting this evidence. And what we do is use kind of various types of statistical techniques to address this issue of causality. And the simplest way of thinking about that is just to think that we ask the question, if a society democratizes, if you look sort of before and after, so don't just compare Sweden and Belgium to Zimbabwe and the Democratic Republic of Congo, but if you look at the society over time and you look at what happens when a society democratizes, what happens to economic growth, what happens to income per capita when it democratizes, sort of comparing it to itself over time, if you like, then what we find is very robust evidence that income per capita goes up by about a fifth if a country on average democratizes. Okay, so you could say that's a very significant and big effect. Of course, it's much smaller than the differences in income per capita between Zimbabwe and Belgium, but it's significant anyway. I'll talk a little bit about that if I have time. So here's the picture. You could think of zero as being when a country democratizes, and then the dark line is income per capita after democratization. So we find that there's a 20% increase in income per capita. Okay, how does that work? Vanessa talked about, we're going to talk about mechanisms and the channels via which democracy impacts economic development. We find many interesting things. So we find systematic increases in investment in education. We find a large fall in the incidence of civil war and conflict, for example, which I think nowadays many people think of as being a key impediment to development. So democracy favors more inclusion. It stops grievances. It creates processes whereby grievances can be resolved and discussed and deliberated. So it reduces conflict. I think that's an interesting mechanism. And Stefan also mentioned health. We find significant falls in infant mortality as a measure of kind of health. So bottom line, we find democracies provide more public goods of exactly the sort that I discussed at the start are crucial for promoting development, along with the intuition I gave. So you might say, if that evidence is so clear cut, why on earth is there a debate about this? And I think the reason there's a debate is that there's enormous heterogeneity between democracies and also within dictatorships. So some democracies are much less good at providing public goods than others. So that study that I showed you just sort of classifies everything into you're a dictatorship or you're a democracy. So it treats all democracies and all dictatorships in some sense as the same without conceptualizing all this heterogeneity. But obviously there's a lot of heterogeneity in the world. Some democracies are very clientelistic. There's vote buying, there's patronage. That's not so consistent with public good provision. Some dictatorships, for whatever reason, decide to provide public goods, you could say, since China after 1978. So you could ask yourself, well, okay, I understand that democracy on average, is good for public good provisions, good for economic growth. But what if we get a good dictator? Couldn't we find a good dictator? And I think the idea here is that, well, maybe, but I think that there's no reliable mechanism for getting good dictators. That's what the data suggests. There's very interesting research about, what happens when leaders die in different countries. And, you could get, here's Chairman Mao dies in the top left. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but when Chairman Mao dies, there's a rapid increase in economic growth, as we know, in China as a consequence of Deng Xiaoping coming to power and promoting economic growth. Okay, so you could get Deng Xiaoping, but you could get President Xi also, or you could get Mao Zedong, and here's Guinea. You could get Sekou Touré. Sekou Touré dies after, presiding over decades of economic decline in Guinea, and then there's a dramatic turnaround. So sometimes you do get good dictators, and other times you get bad dictators. So what the data suggests is that, on average, it's much better to have democracy. I think that's pretty obvious. Okay, you could imagine, that I gave you a simple story about incentives and how democracy creates different incentives, and it creates an incentive to pay more attention to the mass of people. And the way you do that is through public good provision. I think that's a pretty robust intuition. You can all think of counterexamples to that, but I guess what I'm saying here is that, okay, fine, there are counterexamples, but how do you get a good dictator? This is actually something that Aristotle discussed in the Politics, a long time ago, when he was discussing his sort of comparative constitutions and what types of constitutions were best for society. And the notion of kind of dictator was really dismissed as a tyranny, that it always tends to deteriorate into tyranny. And I think that's the big picture. You could imagine, political systems are embedded in cultures, and if you've read Confucius, that Confucius thought that the way to get good governance was not through institutions, but through cultivating the virtue of rulers. That's why President Xi likes quoting Confucius so much nowadays. But I think that what the social science suggests is that that's not a reliable way of getting prosperity, to cultivate the virtue of leaders or expect to get good leadership. You need institutions to channel people's incentives. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that democracy is one of the things that channels the interests of politicians in the interests of society. Okay. I should stop, shouldn't I?
Thank you, James. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So, you've already spoken a bit about the heterogeneity and the difference within each of these categories, and we'll come back to this in the last part of the session. But what we want to go into right now with the next two speakers is issues of data, really. And we want to look at is this finding that democracy does cause development or growth, is that robust? to all sorts of data issues. So our next speaker is John Dosis, and he is Associate Professor of Political Science at Bucknell University, where he's also co-director of the Bucknell Institute of Public Policy. And he has worked in the field of international political economy with a focus on the politics of development, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And today he will present his research on democracy and data quality. And we are very grateful that you're here. We look forward to your presentation.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Perfect. Thank you for that. Good afternoon. My name is John Dosis. I'm currently in West Africa, where I'm on a sabbatical studying topics related to democracy and development. So we just heard democracy promotes development, but why? We were given a lot of reasons. But one connection, perhaps less recognized than others, is between democracy and data. Promoting development, that is what I think of it as make people living better lives, requires many things. But one thing is that it requires information. To make progress, we have to know what the issues are and what needs to be done about those issues. This means that countries must be open and honest about the state of their economy and the people's lives there. And it also means people themselves must be able to express their views honestly without fear of reprisal. People must be able to speak truthfully about the fact that they live in mosquito-infested waters, as my neighbors do. Data matters. It gives us the problems, their severity, and perhaps most importantly, the potential solutions. Research has looked at the connection between political regimes and data. The conclusions, I believe, are clear. At the country level, democracies report more data. Specifically, they report more data on important economic outcomes like debt, like inflation. They also report more data on development outcomes like infant mortality. The evidence, I believe, on this point is robust. For this reason, democracies are said to be more transparent than their authoritarian counterparts. When it comes to transparency, the case for democracy is clear. And for development, transparency is important. If we don't report data on infant mortality or educational outcomes, then we won't know if there's a problem or not. In addition, democracies not only report more data, but they also report better data. In my own research with Chris McGee, we have found that democracies report more accurate data about economic growth. Deviations in growth rates between data reported to the World Bank and those calculated using satellite images of nighttime lights are greater for authoritarian regimes than democratic regimes. So no matter what the dictators say about their economies, the lights don't lie. Data about development are ultimately about individual people's lives. Thus, understanding how political regimes affect what people can and cannot say is a critical consideration. To this point, research indicates in authoritarian regimes that the data bubbling up from the people is less transparent and less honest than it probably would be otherwise. Revolutions like those in the Arab Spring take us by surprise. Why? Research says we are surprised because in authoritarian regimes, one cannot gauge the true temperature of the people. Preferences are falsified until one day, seemingly out of the blue, they are no longer falsified. Years of suppression of opinions, thoughts, and problems cannot last forever, and eventually it explodes. Preference falsification also affects what one can and cannot ask. In my own research, for example, I cannot ask if people support the president by name. People don't want to be on the record, even if it's anonymous, saying something about the president by name, or if they have to say something, they'll just claim a position of support. In authoritarian countries, then, sizing things up is a way of life. Think before you speak and adjust your responses accordingly. This, however, is not life in democratic countries. In democratic countries, people are free to say what they want, and thus data cannot be manipulated in the ways that it can in an authoritarian regime. Importantly, authoritarian leaders push this mentality of sizing things up. Consider perhaps an extreme, yet nonetheless illustrative example. In 1937, Soviet census takers reported a population that had not grown by much, at least not as much as expected by Stalin. The data were thus suppressed, and sadly, the census takers were executed. The new census takers reported strong and robust population growth. When you're free, you don't have to do this. One of my students here told me, I can't just freely say the things you do. Prof, he said, you are free in your mind, we are not. However, when people are not free, they calculate, and this affects what they say. This affects our data. Consider this data on well-being that I recently collected in West Africa. Here, respondents report significantly higher levels of well-being to an American enumerator on the left compared to an African enumerator on the right. As you can see, there's about a 2-point difference, which on a 10-point scale is a sizable effect. Or consider this data on non-response rates to a question about voting in a hypothetical election in the United States. When the enumerator is a local African, they opt to not answer the question at much higher rates than when the enumerator is American. Why? Why are people misreporting as in the case of their well-being? And why are they not reporting as in the case of voting? Well, there's certainly a host of reasons, but one that has consistently emerged in my qualitative work is some suspicion, anxiety, or perhaps fear of saying something that can be construed as a negative reflection upon the government. To an outside enumerator, people say their lives are better than they actually are. And in a twist, they show no signs of being reluctant to answer questions for the same enumerator. Nothing to see here. All is good. In talking to people, the story of anxiety or fear emerges actually quite often. I find that people are afraid to talk about development as it relates to politics. Recently, I spoke with this woman and I said to her, you shouldn't have to walk around water like that. She, of course, agreed. I told her and her friend about this exact conference, and I said, I will say something to policymakers who hopefully can make a difference. They thought I said I was going to talk to their policymakers, and one of the women grasped her throat in a choking manner and said, no, don't do it. I showed a friend this presentation, and she laughed and said, the water is like that outside and inside of my house. I asked, can you say something? She said in French, no, je ne peux pas, c'est trop dangereux pour moi. No, I cannot, it is too dangerous for me. So what then are the implications of these findings? What do I think you should take away? I would suggest 3 points. First, we need to differentiate between measurement and manipulation error. All development data is going to have some measurement error, but this is different than manipulation error. The former is random, the latter is not. The Soviet census takers in 1937 is a clear example of manipulation error. Unfortunately, however, I do not think that manipulation error is a thing of the past. Authoritarian regimes still have the incentives and the means to manipulate their development data, and I believe they do. This matters. Second, and building on this last point, it is imperative to question development outcomes comparing to democratic versus authoritarian regimes. Are these regimes playing by the same rules? In Africa, authoritarian regimes like China claim their political system is best suited to promote development. They cite impressive numbers, and this has a powerful effect. Dictatorship, the data evidently shows, beats democracy in the race for development. Famous musician Salfi Keita from Mali said recently, democracy is not good for Africa. The continent, he said, needs a benevolent dictator like what he sees in China. Someone, he says, who loves his country. Of course, these views rest on data that shows the supposedly superior performance of authoritarian regimes compared to democratic regimes. In this space, however, I would just suggest first asking, do I believe the data? Is there an incentive to manipulate, and can they manipulate? Third, I would like to reiterate that one of the multiple pathways by which democracy promotes development is through transparent and honest data. In promoting free thought and expression, democracy gives us high quality data, and this in turn helps to promote better lives. So in closing, I would like to add that in my own life, I've benefited immensely from being able to live in a free and democratic country. I can imagine my life in other political spaces, and I know I would have suffered as a result. Moreover, and most importantly, I believe the scientific evidence to date is clear. The case for democracy is strong and robust. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, John. That was a very, very powerful presentation. And also, I think it just perfectly illustrates how relevant the case for democracy is now within what we call the third wave of autocratization, and what the dire consequences and implication of this third wave are, actually. Now, to return and put the focus back on this democracy and growth nexus. I already said before, our next speaker, Mario Maggioni, will join, and he will present the insights from his work on a meta-analysis that sort of gathers the evidence across a range of studies of the democracy and growth nexus. And so he can take into account differences in econometric specifications or measures of democracy, or so on and so forth. Mario Maggioni is the professor of economics at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. And aside from the work he's presenting now, he is very well known for his work in the fields of economics of innovations, regional economics, social network analysis, development economics, and conflict studies. And we are very happy to welcome you here today, Mario. If you want to proceed and share your screen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Let's just do it again.
Yes.
Is it working?
Yes, very much so. We don't see the full screen yet.
Okay, yeah, but in a moment that should be the case, okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so thanks, Vanessa, and thanks also, Stefan, for the invitation. And so before starting, let me just give a kind of justification after James showed picture on Zimbabwe and John was speaking from West Africa. Now I see the kind of caricature of an armchair economist, not even working on data, secondary data, but even working on data that people have already collected and published on different papers. So let's just start with why I think that a meta-analysis has some reason to be, and why, in fact, Vanessa and Stefan decided to invite me to this important conference. So as we said, there's quite a long tradition in scientific literature dealing with the nexus between democracy and growth. However, if you look at the kind of results, it seems that the kind of results were mixed. Now, in 2019, Acemoglu, Naidu, Restrepo, and James produced a paper whose title was a kind of tombstone to this literature. Say, democracy does cause growth, and it seems that, okay, no one can say anything different from that. However, despite that, and by the way, we also reported their results in our meta-analysis, I think that the meta-analysis still have something to say. And why? Because as Vanessa just said, we were able to tackle the different ways that different researchers use in order to measure this nexus. And in a sense, with the meta-analysis, we can say something even more complete, just by showing that it's not that an important researcher has said something definite on a given topic, but that there is a consensus on the scientific community that democracy does cause growth. And I think that this conference is in fact built on the idea that you need to show that there is a consensus and you want to share this consensus to a wider audience. Now, what we did in 2020 is that we performed what I call a new meta-analysis, because there was already another meta-analysis by Doukouriakos and Ulubashoglu in 2008. Therefore, let's say the papers were reviewed until 2005. So there was, we thought, space for a new meta-analysis just to look at 15 years of new evidence. So we base our studies on almost 200 papers and 2,000 models that covers, in fact, 36 years of research. And we also wanted to have a kind of benchmark and compare the effect of democracy and growth with another usual suspect of growth, which is human capital. And therefore, for the limited subsample of papers in our sample that included both measure of democracy and measure of human capital, we also measure the effect of human capital on economic growth. Now, what we found, 4 bullet points, and maybe I just add a 5th one, is that definitely democracy has a positive and significant effect on growth. So we can say that literature has established that as a fact, coming back to your introduction. The second is that the size of this effect is smaller than that of human capital. However, having said so, we have to remember that, first of all, we are based just on a subset of papers that were including both variables. And second, that democracy may have an indirect effect, that human capital may have an indirect effect on growth, because democracy, as we will see, I think, in the next session, is in fact promoting a higher education effort, and therefore a higher stock of human capital in the democratic countries. Second, the democratic growth nexus appears to be stronger in more recent papers, let's say papers that were not reviewed in the previous meta-analysis. So if this is just a consequence of better data, if possible, better technique, yes. But in fact, what we were able is to state the first bullet point much stronger than it was possible before our meta-analysis. And finally, as James was pointing out, yes, democracy is good for growth. However, the meaning of democracy as well as the meaning of autocracy is really different across world region and even historic periods. So let me just show very briefly the results. So we'll not go into the technical details. So this is in fact a picture that shows the kernel distribution of a Fisher Z-score. Just forget about all this mumbo jumbo, typical for academics, but just look at these two distributions. And you see that the peak of the distribution is away from 0. So that means that there is and is on the right. So there's a positive effect of both human capital and growth and democracy and growth. However, as you see, the effect of human capital is higher. The distribution is taller than the one on democracy. The second is showing you that the size of the coefficient, so you see that the blue point is slightly higher with compared to the red point, so that both the size of the coefficient and the confidence interval of the post 2008, i.e. the paper that were reviewed in the previous Dukuliago-Zulubazoglu survey, so that there's a clear effect that is shown by more recent papers. And the third one is showing you the existence of heterogeneity in different samples. That the first one refers to papers that include data from all regions, continental region as defined by the World Bank. The second one, the second couple, again, the red refers to all period and the blue refers to the period 1950-2009. And so you see that this effect of democracy on growth is especially high and significant for Africa. And on the other hand, you see some lower effects for South Asia. And that may have to do with something that James already pointed out about the quality of autocracy in South Asia being qualitatively different from the quality of autocracy in Africa. So what we got out our meta-analysis is that reviewing the scientific literature on the effect of democracy and growth, we can affirm that there is a positive and significant effect. However, that this effect is still heterogeneous in time and space. So that may lead either to even got a more precise definition of democracy and autocracy, and even more correct way to estimate this nexus. Now, just as a final slide, let me just point it out to a possible extension. In the topics that I'm covering in my research, Vanessa, I think that just quoted also that the last things I'm interested in is behavioral economics. No, if we believe that preference can be endogenous, i.e. that to live in a democracy can shape your preference, then that could be an interesting channel through which democracy can do an effect on, for example, growth. And let me just show you something that is not a causation, so it's just an impression. So this is just a picture that me, together with the three co-authors that we worked on the meta-analysis, Marco Colagrossi and Domenico Rossignoli, we just made this simple correlation between the global preference survey extracted by the work by Falk and others in 2008 and V-Dem index, i.e. the electoral democracy index. And here you see we just plotted the correlation between democracy and risk-taking preferences. Both data are from 2008 and 11. The idea being that we assume that the construction of preference is a kind of stock. So we just took the two things at the same date. So again, we have lots of problem probably of endogeneity, but for the moment we just forget about that. But what I want you to show you is that, you know, if you just look at the bullets at the points here, it seems that you just have no relation whatsoever. However, if you look at world region, what you see is that, for example, that relation between the electoral democracy index and the risk-taking attitudes in Africa is an increasing one. And on the other end, the same kind of correlation for South Asia. So the pink one is Africa and the light blue correlation is from South Asia, instead is a negative one. So definitely, despite we were able to show the existence of a general positive and significant relation, there's still work to do in order to understand better this heterogeneity in space and time. That's all, thanks.
Thank you, Mario. So yeah, thank you for this presentation. I think now, after having heard these three presentations already, there are really two big issues that we can still answer with respect to the democracy and growth nexus here. And one is, as has been pointed out so many times, the heterogeneity between different countries. So different countries have different democracy growth relationships. And how can we account for that? And what happens when we account for that? Do we still get those same results? And the other thing, or the other question we can still address is, what is it about democratic institutions? Which building blocks drive this relationship? And I could think of no better person than Markus Eberhard to provide some insights here. Markus Eberhard is Associate Professor in the School of Economics at the University of Nottingham, and he has worked on financial crises, on King China in the 18th and 19th centuries, on democracy and development, on knowledge spillovers and absorptive capacity. Now you could say that's a range of topics, and it is, but it has one common denominator, so to speak, and that is macro panel data econometrics. In both linear and nonlinear models and approaches. And Markus is an expert on those macro panel data models. And as such, he is the ideal candidate to talk about these settings in which we expect effects that are potentially very heterogeneous across countries and that change over time and are potentially nonlinear. So today, this is just exactly what he's going to talk about. Markus, the floor is yours if you want to share your screen.
Okay, I should be sharing the screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, Vanessa. That was a wonderful introduction. It's somewhat undermined by my having to point out that Vanessa is the co-author on this paper. So you've just heard from one of the global experts on the democracy and growth research, Jim Robinson, and so I don't need to tell you in great detail that the consensus now is that the democratic dividend is positive and large. And so what in this research Vanessa and I would like to look at is a little bit closer at this definition of democracy, namely, as Vanessa suggested, what are the building blocks of the various political and other institutions that drive this positive relationship between democracy and growth that we observe over the long run. And so what we do in this paper is we take an overarching concept of liberal democracy, and then we drill down to the individual building blocks in order to see which of these building blocks drives economic prosperity. And since Vanessa is at V-Dem, I have become very familiar with these indices that V-Dem produces. So we're using the V-Dem definition of a liberal democracy. That's our top level indicator. And this is made up of elements of polyarchy, also known as electoral democracy, and then the liberal component. You can think of this as civil rights. And what we are primarily interested in this paper, in this presentation, are these lower level indicators. So we go from a very sort of abstract concept of liberal democracy. We've heard of Confucius and we've heard of Aristotle, and we go down to a much more tangible level of clean elections, freedom of expression. I saw a comment on the chat, freedom of association, suffrage, elected chief executives. These are the elements of electoral democracy, the building blocks of electoral democracy. And similarly for the liberal component, the rule of law, which contains property rights that economists are so keen on, but also constraints on the executive, so both legislative and judicial constraints. And so here is, you can't read this because it's too small, but these are some existing empirical and theoretical papers that use one or the other building blocks in their work, either to define democracy or to define institutions and to show the relationship between institutions or democracy and growth. So as I mentioned, in our work, we want to focus on this lower tier. Two of the indicators have miraculously dropped out. So this is because our data set from 1949 to 2018, the post-World War II period, virtually all countries in the world have already adopted universal suffrage. And the elements of elected chief executives also show very little variation over time. So very few countries move, and therefore we cannot analyze these, or it's futile to analyze these. Before I go to this lower level of the building blocks of democracy, let me show you our results for liberal democracy, and that gives you an indication of how we present our findings. So we have a very big picture result in that liberal democracy has a perpetual growth effect. Democracy is the dividend that keeps on giving. So you may remember the graph that Jim showed in his presentation, where you saw this slightly concave relationship over time, so that he mentioned the 20% income effect of democratization. And our findings here suggest that in fact, if you use these methods that we adopted, which are related to allowing each country to have a different relationship between democracy and growth, you get a much more linear relationship over time. So that means the longer you stay in democracy, the more you will grow. So this is our average relationship, and I'm going to add some markers here that indicate to you that down here in the early years of democracy, when you've only spent 5 or maybe 10 years in democracy, we cannot comfortably say that this effect is statistically significant. But once we go beyond 20 years, you can see that this rises almost linearly with the number of years you've spent in democracy. So a quite big picture result. Before we move on to our lower level indicators. Now, of course, it would be somewhat strange if we studied each of these 6 building blocks in isolation. If we said, well, clean elections on their own have this and that growth effect, because somebody might come along and say, well, I believe that clean elections can only work if you have freedom of association, or if you have freedom of expression, or if you have these other elements of the liberal component, for instance. So in our analysis, we take these, what we call rival indicators, into account. So if we show you the results for clean elections, that is conditioning on the evolution of freedom of expression, freedom of association, and the elements of the liberal component. So if we do that for the sub-components, for the building blocks of electoral democracy, you see the same picture again. On the y-axis, the effect of becoming a democracy in percent on the x-axis, the years you have spent in democracy. And so we start off with freedom of expression. You can see that initially it takes quite a long time before we establish a statistically significant effect, but then we see slow and steady rise of this. So in the long run, it would appear that freedom of expression is something that continues to be valuable for economic growth. Freedom of association, in contrast, is something that clearly matters for a long time early on in the democratization process or for the new democracies. But then we can see that this effect peters out. So countries that have spent quite a long time in democracy no longer get an additional economic input, economic prosperity from freedom of association. And finally, for these types of indicators of electoral democracy, the building blocks, clean elections is really the one that from the word go seems to have a positive significant effect that also rises linearly. So these together with freedom of expression, clean elections seems to be the building block that drives this perpetual growth effect of liberal democracy that we see in the higher level analysis. So what we wanted to do now for this forum to sort of link these results a little bit to what's happened over the last 10 years globally. So we're looking here at data from the V-Dem Democracy Report, which was just published very recently. And we're looking at primarily the dark blue and the very light blue bars. So these are over the last 10, 11 years, the number of countries in which these specific indicators have declined. And you can see that for the light blue ones, freedom of expression, these are the ones that are at the very top. So many countries have seen decline in these types of indicators. And clean elections are the dark blue ones. So also quite a sizable number of countries have seen decline in these indicators. And that's quite worrying because we've just shown you that in the long run, these are driving economic growth. So if we see a reduction in this type of political institutions, then this will have long-run implications for economic prosperity. Now, remember, we have the second building block of the liberal component. So I'm going to show you the results for these three elements of liberal component, exactly the same setup here. So we see the rule of law has an important, significant, positive effect, which then peters out over time. So over time, in terms of how long countries have had a high level of rule of law. Similarly, for judicial constraints, these seem very important. So judicial constraints on the executive seem very important early on and then peter out. And then we have the legislative constraints on the executive. And these show this sort of characteristic concave relationship over time, but clearly positive, significant, and rising. Again, we want to link that to the V-Dem Democracy Report. Here we only have data for 1 year. So this is the mean change in these different indicators from 1990 to 2020. And there's a bit of, recoloring going on. V-Dem I haven't used the same colors as V-Dem. So we are now interested in these gray areas, the elements of the liberal component. And so here on the right, I'm redefining them for you a little bit. These here at the top are all related to freedom of movement. So, that's easily argued to be COVID related. And once we take those three out, we can see that the green ones are the ones that have sort of legislative constraints on the executive have seen the decline. Judicial constraints, not so much. So they even have seen an increase in some countries. So again, a little worrying that exactly those building blocks of democracy that drive long-run growth are the ones that are being eroded most recently. So thanks very much. This is what I wanted to present here. We wanted to ask what the building blocks are that drive the positive liberal democracy relationship. So we drill down from this overarching liberal democracy concept, and we use causal model. Jim has given a nice summary of what a causal model is. And our findings are that, very importantly, liberal democracy is not a one-off effect. It's a perpetual growth effect. So it's the dividend that keeps on giving. And then we also pinpoint freedom of expression, clean elections, and legislative constraints on the executive as important long-run growth determinants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you to all of our panelists. Now, I would like to ask all panelists to turn on their camera so that we can see you. John, you have to see if this works with your internet connection. If not, that's fine as well. And I want to give you panelists the chance to respond to each other. And I'm already seeing in the chat that this heterogeneity is also, or in the Q&A tool, basically, not in the chat, this heterogeneity between countries, between world regions is of a lot of interest. So people were asking about this 20% effect, over what time horizon, how does this differ between low, middle, upper middle, and high income countries? And Marcus, I think your presentation already illustrated this to some extent and accounted for that. But maybe in your responses, you could come back to that question. I would like to start with Jim and then proceed in the order in which we went in the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this heterogeneity is, there's clear patterns that this phenomenon of developmental dictatorship, for example, is more or less completely restricted to East Asia. You don't see developmental dictatorship in Latin America, and you see little bits of it in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe, when Meles Zenawi was in charge in Ethiopia, or when President Kagame is currently in charge in Rwanda. But I think just what's going on in Ethiopia now shows that they never had a political system in Ethiopia which was consistent with making Ethiopia a really prosperous country. So I think what is that? I think that's a research question in terms of trying to conceptualize, what is it about East Asia that's distinct? Obviously, there's a long history of political centralization in a way that there wasn't in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So I think people think it could be something to do with state centralization and the kind of the history of the state. So somehow authoritarians are more likely to be able to do something because they have this somehow state capacity or history of bureaucratization. But I don't think, as this is why I mentioned Confucius, but it seems more likely to me that there's something cultural about this connection between authoritarianism and growth in East Asia. But again, I guess I would revert to the position that what we know is that this is probably only transitory in any case. I think if you look at South Korea, what's remarkable about South Korea, yes, there was a period of rapid economic growth under General Park, and General Park drove economic growth in the 1970s, until he was assassinated. But the real story about Korea, the incredible flourishing of Korea, as a culture, not just an economy, but, you have K-pop, you have everything. Is just this explosion of inclusion and upsurge of talent. That's unimaginable in dictatorship, it seems to me.
Thank you, Jim. John, do you want to?
Yes, please. I would follow on that and say, as an example, Cote d'Ivoire under Houphouët-Boigny, there was, for a long time, in terms of a benevolent dictator, right, there was growth under his regime, but it fell apart, and it fell apart in ways that were that have been awful for people in that country. And one of the things that especially after his death, one of the things that became so problematic were identities. And so one of the things that Mario, you said that really caught my attention was the effect of democracy shaping preferences. And I also wonder and if it shapes identities as well, and if it pushes people towards having less of an ethnic only identity, more of a national identity. And if it does so, then does that in some way connect back to what Jim was saying about public goods? And if democracy promotes a broader thinking, that, to me would be a beneficial effect about how it, promotes prosperity and growth.
Yes. And I also wanted to add one thing here, and that is, you were talking about the growth that then fell apart. And this is actually a very consistent result that our colleague at V-Dem, Carl-Henrik Knudsen, has found in a number of his studies that democracy acts as a safety net. So in autocracies, we often see this, you have a benevolent dictator for some time, but then the growth falls apart. And that doesn't happen in democracies. And you have, so democracy or democratic institutions act as a safety net. Mario, if you want to.
Yeah, thanks. So I saw that most of the question in the question and answer just referred to the last slide. Yeah, the one that I was arm wrestling with Stefan. Let's include that or not. And in fact, this is a sort of content of the next paper. So there's not published. So definitely we should take care of endogeneity, because that is really a key problem in that kind of analysis. Here, I just wanted to show a correlation just because it was sort of supporting the idea that there is lots of heterogeneity in a different world region. Now, let me just maybe add to few observations. The first one I didn't talk because seems a little bit too technical, but in our meta-analysis, we show that there are no publication bias. I mean, we reviewed both published papers and working papers, and one of the idea is maybe you find the results because editors likes good results, and that's why if you don't find any significant result, then that may reduce the probability of having your paper published. Okay, so we test for that, and there's no publication bias. So this is again a reinforcement of the kind of conclusion that's we reached. And the second thing is that despite the fact that in 36 years definitely econometrics has improved, the data has improved, but we couldn't find significant effect of both the econometric techniques, both the modeling techniques, and also the databases. But speaking in favor of V-Dem, seems that the time that people were able to use the V-Dem data set was too short to have an impact on our database. So we're just waiting for a much longer time period, and maybe we will show that there is an effect of V-Dem. Quite, that is my estimate, but let's see what the data will show. And so, yeah, in a sense, I think that this is also pointing out to the fact that despite heterogeneity, the nexus is robust to all the analysis. Thanks.
That's a very good summary, Mario. I couldn't have said it better. Marcus, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I saw that there were some comments in the Q&A that were related to kind of whether we use the same definition of democracy, and so I'd like to say a few things about that. So quite a few people like using certain quotes about, democracy means different things to different people. But if we're talking about a sort of a top level, high level definition of democracy, then it doesn't really matter which data source we use. And you can see that in the research Jim Robinson has done with his co-authors, the robustness, whether you use political scientists, Chebub et al., Boyce et al., or whether you use other indicators, you get qualitatively similar results of long-run, positive, large, statistically significant effects of economic development. And in the paper with Vanessa, we do the same thing. So granted, we use a very different empirical method, and it would be too cumbersome to go into details here. But what we take advantage of in our paper is the V-Dem data set, this hierarchical data. So there's a comment here, somebody saying, you use the concept of liberal democracy, that's a rich country thing. So as so often, it's about the definition, and sometimes we use, so I'm pretty sure there's lots of political scientists who use liberal democracy in a very different way that we would use it here, or V-Dem uses it. So we specifically refer to this V-Dem index for liberal democracy, which is made up of the building blocks of the liberal component, which has executive constraints and rule of law, and which has electoral democracy. And what I didn't show, because for time reasons, we also look at these mid-levels. So we show that there's this perpetual growth effect coming from electoral democracy, whereas more sort of a concave relationship, an effect that peters out from the liberal component. But what we can do with the V-Dem data is we can do this drilling down, because the way these indicators build on each other has been thought through, and they have been developed for exactly this purpose, so that you're able to go from a high level to a mid level to a low level indicator of democracy, or a building block of democracy. And so what I want to emphasize is that we may be using different indicators for the high level democracy indicators, but it doesn't matter. Emphasizing again, the evidence is strong across different methodologies in Jim's papers, and you've seen this in Mario's paper as well. You know, it doesn't matter. The methodology doesn't matter. It's in all these papers use different. They use Polity4. They use, you know, all kinds of different indicators. So the evidence is very, very strong. For our specific paper, we use the V-Dem data because this makes a lot of sense for us. But the case for democracy is strong from an economic perspective.
Thank you, Marcus. Again, better than I could have said it. Now let's check the meeting room, actually, the conference room on site. Stefan is on site, and I just wanted to see if some people on site have questions.
Yes, can we get a camera of the room as well? I should wear a mask when I for. Oh,
we don't hear you yet.
The mic.
And we also don't see you, just now. That's much better.
All right. It's on.
It's on.
Nope.
Is this better?
Yes,
Good.
much better.
Hi, I'm Anke Höfler, and I would like to thank all the panelists for excellent presentations. So my particular interest is in Africa. It's the least democratic region, and it's the poorest world region. Of course, not all countries are undemocratic, or not all countries are poor in Africa, but I would like to ask you all about the African experience. So John was sort of talking about the fear. So Africans are quite fearful, but this gets better with democracy. So that's very hopeful. Mario was talking about risk, and risk taking increases through democracy. Okay, correlation, but it looks quite hopeful. And Marcus and Vanessa showed us that democracy keeps giving, but democracies are quite young in Africa. So my question maybe mainly to Jim would be sort of, how do we make sure that we don't have democratic backsliding in Africa, and how can we help African countries go, I mean, not from the outside, but sort of from help needs to come from the inside, you know, how can African democracies be stabilized to get to the point of where Marcus and Vanessa tell us that democracy is particularly useful? Thank you.
Jim, if you want to answer that right away. But you're still muted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, there's a lot of questions. I mean, I think that Africa is relatively poor and undemocratic. You could say many other, there's many other institutional problems in Africa, and it's an interesting discussion as, the extent to which democracy sort of facilitates the creation of other institutions. I think the evidence is much scarcer on something like that because it's been much less studied. What's the connection between democratization and state building, for example? Most African countries have very weak central states. They're not good at raising taxes or regulating society. So there's issues of sort of state capacity, which are connected, to other components of political institutions. But I think we understand much less about that. And you could also say, on average, politics in Africa is much more kind of patrimonial. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it's much more based on personal relationships and social networks, and so that maybe affects the quality of democracy. But I think, the evidence that we've seen so far suggests that perhaps the payoff to democracy in Africa is even larger than other parts of the world. So that seemed to be my interpretation of what Mario was showing. So I think that, there's evidence that that's a good thing. I think there's lots of evidence from the Afrobarometer that Africans, like democracy, they value democracy, and they want democracy. And if you thought historically, Africa was a kind of intensely democratic place. There's democracy and participation in innumerable African societies historically. So I think there's a very powerful basis for democracy in Africa, both culturally and historically. There's evidence that people want democracy. I think the problem is just, that colonial powers took hundreds of these people with different political systems and different institutions, and they threw them together in this thing called Nigeria, and there's never really been a social contract in Nigeria. There's never been consensus about, or not, maybe not consensus, but just a kind of practical way of designing institutions to make this thing work. How is it that ordinary people can get the people in Abuja or in the federal government to respond? And, there's the sort of fundamental problems of institution building that still need to go on. Because I think there's lots of progress. There's lots of progress in Kenya, in Ghana, in Sierra Leone. There's less progress in other African countries, but there is progress. But African societies, in my view, are still clearing up the mess that colonialism and colonial powers left them. And they were left with a heck of a difficult problem, and it just takes time to solve that problem. I think that's the way I think about it. But there's all sorts of potential there for democracy and massive potential for prosperity as well. But some basic problems are still, works in progress.
Thank you, Jim. John and Mario, Anke was also asking about, how can we assist African countries in terms of democracy promotion or protection, in terms of potentially generating a less fearsome environment and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts. I think there has to be a sense of urgency, though. Lives here are still, I see it every day, all the time. People are living lives they're searching for better lives, and they need assistance, and they're going to find it. And whether that's through democracy or whether that's through some alternative regimes, right? They need to live better lives. So they have to be able to come out of what is still a situation for so many people, which is effectively extreme poverty. So that being said, I really think it's imperative that we make progress, and that progress is made in their lives. The other thing I would say is information, which was the point of my talk, but getting people access to information, getting people access to the internet that actually works, could do a lot for people here. And then, the final thing I would say is letting them participate in the democratic processes, letting them be a part of that, and to continue to do that, and so to continue to have elections, to not accept coups as a part of democracy, so to push that democratic process. Those are the things that at least immediately come to my mind.
Can I just add a thought? Usually, in a sense, when my students raise questions like that, and I say, okay, until here I can answer from my research. Now this is just an opinion of a guy you meet in a bar, and that's nothing more than that. So let me try to answer this very general question with a piece of my research, so that I can stand back to the scientific kind of opinion. We all know that democracy brings more and better education. However, we know that there's also a feedbacks going from more and better education down to democracy. And so my idea is that I think that history has shown that the idea of the domino theory of democracy, or exporting democracy, has shown some kind of limitation. So my idea is what we can do for Africa is, for example, reinforce all the process that are increasing, for example, the accumulation of human capital and education. What we show is, for example, that the effect of international support system for helping African students, especially we were working on a very tiny case in the Democratic Republic of Congo, did obtain good results. And, you know, that's maybe a long queue, a long story. However, I think this is the way to build democracy endogenously from bottom up, and not just trying to make, you know, crazy scientist kind of Dr. Strangelove kind of international politics kind of theory.
Thank you, Mario. We now have one more question in the room and then another online question. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Julia Lange from the German Development Institute. Thanks for the excellent presentations. I have a question and a comment. So my question is to Jim. It's on the narrative. I mean, the narrative or the analysis that Staffan gave, or also the V-Dem report in the beginning, was that if we look at the number of people living in democracies and autocracies, there are more people living in autocracies now. So it's about the number of people living in autocracies. My question is, did you run your data with population weighted data? So what would the results of your analysis, the one economic growth and democracy, look like if it would be population weighted? Would it be a different result maybe? And then a comment or an observation that just kind of reinforces what was said about the variance of the relationship between growth and democracy in different world regions. At DIE, together with V-Dem, we just did a background paper for the next Human Development Report in 2022 on human development, social cohesion, and democracy. And the finding there is the same, right? On a global scale, global level, there is a positive relationship between growth and GDP per capita growth and democracy. And that's, well, in the case of social cohesion, it was even negative, but for democracy, there are no significant results for that. And then we compared these findings with a subsample, including low-income countries and middle-income countries, and that speaks a bit to your findings, Marcus and Vanessa, that there we see very similar results. So that might be one potential explanation. I think that's something we should dig deeper into as scientists. Thanks.
Jim, do you want?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a debate about this issue of should one weight these should one weight the data by population, but I don't really think that's a very sensible thing to do. You know, that because first of all, then everything is dominated by India and China, and you're sort of saying, well, I don't learn anything, you know, from the history of Mauritius or Barbados about the relationship between democracy and society or economic performance. But I think one does learn something about, you know, the relationship between democracy and prosperity from the history of Mauritius or Barbados. And so I think you have to, you know, if I think I can learn just as much from those countries as I can learn from China, then I don't think you do want to weight the data by population. So we don't do that, no.
Yeah, Marcus, jump right in.
Yeah, thanks. I just thought I wanted to come in on this heterogeneity point. So we have to see where this literature has come from, and it may be quite surprising to people in the room or to people out there, but you know, until the Ashimoglu et al. Paper in 2019, there wasn't really compelling evidence, causal evidence. So we go back to this sort of phrase. You know, before we had papers that used methods that can be attacked, and for that reason, I find it a bit strange. Never mind. So you know, so Jim and his co-authors, they showed that if you assume that every country in the world has the same relationship between democracy and growth, and also the same GDP dynamics over time, then you can estimate this, and you can use methods that are widely regarded as robust, and you can test whether the robustness is true, and so on. And so you then get this really strong positive result of 20%. And this is what we like to build on. Okay, so now let's see whether we can relax this assumption that the democracy growth nexus is the same, because you were talking about population weighting. When you run a pooled model, so if you run just one regression for all the countries in the sample, then there's always and let's presume these differ, the democracy growth nexus differs, then there is some weighting there. The problem is with a fixed effects estimate or some kind of method like this, you don't know what the weighting is. There's some inherent weighting, and it's actually related to the variation in the data. So the country with the highest variation gets the most weight. So we come along and say, okay, we now know that there are methods that can be as rigorous as what Jim and his co-authors did. We can have causal treatment effects, but we can actually have a heterogeneous causal treatment effect. So we look at all those countries that experienced a regime change, and we can have an estimate for each of these. But we go from 6,000 observation in Jim's paper to 45, 50 observations per country in our paper. So we don't want to show you each estimate. We then average, and this is exactly where you can do whatever you want. We show you that. So regarding Anker's question, African countries will have few years in democracy, and so we can see that depending on which indicator you look at, we already see there's a positive significant relationship. So it doesn't make much sense, again, like Jim said, comparing Belgium to Malawi or so if countries only have a few years in democracy, you can't expect that they have 25% GDP growth. So we need to recognize that this is a relatively recent finding. This democracy does cause growth, and that's why it's caused a lot of waves and a lot of citations. And now there's more work to do, and this work that you're interested in is exactly what we want to chart out. So we want to chart out, let's relax some assumption, let's look at subsets of countries, and then maybe also let's talk a bit about sequencing, maybe between economic and political reforms. And so this is kind of the way forward, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Now, so let's sum up. What have we learned? We have learned democracy does cause growth. We have learned this is, even though we know that data from autocracies is likely manipulated, in addition to any sort of measurement error, we know that this finding is robust across different sort of research approaches and different studies. And we know this is even true if we control for differences across countries. And we know it's not only electoral institutions, but it's also the liberal institutions, so the constraints on the executive and rule of law. I would like to take this last moment to thank my panelists, to thank the audience, both virtual and in the room, for lively discussions and many, many questions. And I hope you have a great coffee break now on site. And then I'll see you again at 4 o'clock in half an hour for the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All right, so the coffee is right outside, and nice machines there for espresso and all kinds of things. I thought it was actually pretty good, and something to go along with it. And I will put on my mask again so we can meet out there. And then we'll start again at 4.
Get myself another woman. I can't spend one more night. Ooh, sleeping in this lonely bed. I can't spend one more night. tell you a story about a little girl I know. When she walks into a room, you know she steals the show. She's crazy. And it's more than I can't stand. I'm just crazy about that woman. And she's just crazy about this man. She wakes me every morning with that tender loving touch. Some fools don't get enough, but she just loves me too much. She's crazy. And it's more than I can stand. I'm just crazy about that woman. And she's just crazy about this man. Now sing, baby, right now. She always wants me round when I just ain't got no time. But you know she's got these little ways to make me wanna change my mind. She's crazy. And it's more than I can't stand. I'm just crazy about that woman. And she's just crazy about this man. haven't seen any rain. Dragging around a ball and chain. I haven't seen any rain. Dragging around a ball and chain. Angel says it's 11:15. I'll catch the next elevator to heaven. Time can be a second, can be a minute, an hour, or even a day. Time can be a second, minute, hour, or even a day. Angel says it's 7:15. I'll catch the next elevator to heaven. dragging around a ball and chain. Yes, I am. I haven't seen any rain dragging round a ball and chain. Yes, I am. Angel says it's 7:30. Time to catch the next elevator to heaven. Heaven. Into the room and toss back your hair, but I can't help myself, so I turn to you instead. Yeah, you've got me, babe, and there's nothing I can do. I've got them blue-eyed angel myself say that you've got me, babe. And there's nothing I can do. 'Cause I've got 'em so bad, yeah. I've got them blue-eyed angel blues. Supported you. That's why you got away. And now I'm lost in Kansas. I lost my faith and I can't breathe. Babe, I'm crying 'cause I'm lost without your help.
All right. Oh, yes, I can take this off. Sorry for that. So I guess we are back online and ready for the second and final session of this first half day of the Case for Democracy conference. I believe in the first session, we heard about the relationship, the positive relationship between economic growth, the democracy and economic growth. And there were some evidence also provided that this was linked to increase in human capital and things like education and expansion of human capital. I think also in terms of what human capital is available to society, the economy, to society and more in general in terms of capacities. And there I see at least also a direct link to empowerment and freedom for women, because that's in most societies a little bit more than half of the population. And of course, if women are not free to pursue economic and other activities, then we as societies lose out on all those capabilities, beyond, of course, the sort of the normative and fundamental human rights perspective that we should all, since we are born free and equal, should also be free and equal, right? But that's just to introduce this session. I'm very, very pleased and proud to have with me three prominent speakers, and we'll go in the order of the program. Sirian Dalum is joining us from Oslo, and Robin Harding is joining us from the UK, Oxford, and Pamela Paxton joining us from UT Austin. So this is a fantastic lineup of really cutting edge experts in this important area. And without further ado, I would like to leave the floor first to Sirian to talk to us about research findings on the relationship between education, democracy and education. Sirian.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Can you see my screen, I hope?
Yes. Perfect.
So thank you very much to Stefan and Vanessa and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to this panel. Unfortunately, I could not be there in Brussels. Instead, I'm stuck in very snowy Oslo at the moment, but hopefully we'll still get an interesting discussion today. So the starting point of my presentation today is this notion that democracy is conducive to public services, including education. And the argument, one of the key reasons for that is often assumed to be that democracy facilitates political competition between elites. So officials in a democracy will have to compete in an election to gain access to power, and should therefore be incentivized to invest in public services and to offer public services to get elected, but also that these officials should then be incentivized to stay accountable to citizens and society throughout their term in order to get re-elected. So the notion is then that if citizens want these kind of public services, then officials in democracies should be incentivized to offer them. And as Staffan also already pointed to, and as already been discussed today, there's also extensive evidence that democracies do, in fact, provide more education than autocracies on average. However, most of these studies usually rely on indicators of the quantity of education, such as enrollment in education, average years of education offered, but it doesn't really say so much about what kind of education is offered and what is the quality of the education offer. So that raises the question, does democracy also promote high quality education in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of the skills and knowledge that children get from attending the type of schooling offered? And I've conducted some research to answer this question, and today I'll present some key findings from that research. In particular, I'll present some findings from a study I've conducted together with a colleague at the University of Oslo. And just to briefly preview our finding, we basically find, and this confirms existing research, that democracies do on average offer more education than autocracies, but not necessarily better education. And I'll say more in a second about why we think this is the case. One key motivation for our study is this observation that mass enrollment has expanded very rapidly, and particularly during the last decades. So today, more than 90% of children across the world do attend some kind of primary schooling, although there is some regional variation. However, as it's becoming increasingly clear, much of the education that is offered is unfortunately of a very poor quality. This has recently been emphasized by UNESCO and also by the World Bank, who concluded in a Human Development Report that there's a global learning crisis based on the observation that more than 1/3 of the children that do attend some kind of school leave schooling without really any basic reading or number skills at all. And I think this really raises the question of how democracy and how political institutions can facilitate better education. So in our study, what we basically discuss is that vote-seeking democratic politicians should only really be incentivized to provide public service if that public service can be attributed to the elected officials, so citizens will know who is responsible for the public service in question. The voters can verify whether improvements have been made in that public service, and also that public service is really within the capacity and the reach of public officials to implement. However, when it comes to education quality, these criteria are not necessarily fulfilled. So first of all, I think it's very often difficult for citizens to know who's responsible for education quality and who's responsible for what kind of education is offered. So let's say his school offers really excellent schooling and is well run. It's very difficult to know if that's due to the teachers, if that's due to school management, or if it's due to elected politicians. It's often also hard for voters to really verify whether education get better. Well, I think it's really easy for parents to see that their child, is allowed to go to school. Maybe the school fees are abolished so that children can go to school. It's much harder to evaluate the quality of what is being taught in the schools. And finally, education quality is something that is inherently quite difficult to really implement and improve, even if politicians are incentivized and have the resources to do so. I'm from Norway myself, and in my country, the government has, for the past 30 years, every single government has promised to strengthen education quality in primary and secondary education. But despite having access to a lot of resources to do so, it has not been able to achieve this. It's often hard to implement, and knowledge about what should go into reforms to strengthen quality are often hard to find. So for this reason, we may not necessarily expect that democracies do systematically enhance education quality. In our study, so one important challenge to study this, especially globally, is the question of how to measure education quality. And this is, of course, very challenging. In our study, we rely on student achievement tests as a proxy measure of education quality. It's not a perfect measure, but at least you should tap into quality, is what we argue. And here there's a global data set on such tests in primary, secondary school that combines measures of student achievement tests in mathematics, science, and reading across all countries from 1954 to 2014. And based on this, we estimate the relationship between electoral democracy and education quality. Just to show you quickly this measure of schooling achievements and how it correlates with education quantity, here measured using an average schooling years indicator, we see that the two are clearly really related. So countries that have a very high level of enrollment and offer many years of education also tend to have relatively high schooling achievement tests, but the correlation is really not perfect, and many countries underperform in terms of schooling quality compared to schooling quantity. This slide basically summarizes our main findings. So in these models, we account for not only education quantity, equality, and democracy, but also many other types of factors that we think should influence both education and democracy. And the red dots represent the estimated relationship between education quantity, years of education, and electoral democracy, here using a V-Dem measure. And these are different types of models, but basically we see that there's always a positive and statistically significant relationship between electoral democracy and education quantity in line with previous research. However, it does not seem to be a positive relationship between electoral democracy and education quality that is statistically indistinguishable from zero. So based on this, we cannot really conclude that democracies are no better at all when it comes to student achievements than autocracies. To round off, this is just sort of one study, but our finding is also in line with other studies. And this may serve as a bridge to the next presenter, Robin Harding, who's shown, just to briefly summarize some of his findings, that transitions to democracy in Africa, there's evidence that may lead to expansions in schooling, and also that schooling quality may not be so important for voting intentions among survey respondents in Kenya. And there's also evidence from other studies that there may actually also be a trade-off between education quantity and education quality. So when new democracies invest heavily in expanding access to education, bringing more children into schools and into classrooms, that may also reduce the quality, and that may also explain some of our findings. So to round off, so the main finding from our research is that democracy may be conducive to education quantity, but probably, unfortunately, not to education quality. And this could also partly be because there is a potential tension between these rapid expansions in access to schooling and to what extent schools can offer quality education with high learning outcomes. And I think one important implication of this is how important it is that citizens have access to transparent and open information about the public services and the type of public services and the quality of public services offered by the government and offered by elected officials. And they can sort of verify the quality of those services, including in education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sirian. That's great, and it provides such a good bridge over to the next presenter, Robin Harding, that I hardly have to say anything but to welcome you onto the floor and share your presentation with us. Robin.
Thanks, Stefan. Sorry, I'm just sharing my screen with you. Can you see that now?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you, Stefan, for that introduction, and to Sirian for your presentation, which leads so nicely into mine. First of all, apologies that I had really hoped to be there in person, but my journey was scuppered at the last minute by the UK government's response to COVID. So what I want to talk to you about today is this question of whether democracy improves education outcomes for everyone. And this, as I said, leads nicely from Sirian's presentation about the kind of average effects of democracy on education quantity, but perhaps not quality. Slightly different to some of the other presentations, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my own work, but also talking about some of the findings more broadly from other studies to kind of assess what we know in general. So what is the answer to this question? Well, I guess the answer is, in a way, it depends. The size of the positive average impact of democracy varies across multiple different dimensions. Okay, so I think to date, and as Sirian has mentioned in her presentation, there's pretty good evidence that there is a positive average effect of democracy on both public education spending and on different measures of education outcomes, including enrollment rates and also literacy levels. Although, as we've just heard, if we use kind of other and perhaps better, stronger measures of education quality, like test scores, the effects might be less clear. So overall, there are these positive average effects, but I think there's also really good evidence that the size of these effects varies according to a range of different characteristics. And I want to talk to you about a few of these different characteristics at two different levels. Firstly, at either the level of countries or administrative units, and then secondly, at the individual or group level. Okay, so let me begin by talking about the variation across some kind of country or administrative unit characteristics. So there are three main things that I want to talk about here. I'm not going to talk in detail about variation over levels of economic development. There's quite a few studies that look at this, but the evidence here is somewhat mixed. It's not clear kind of which direction the findings go in, whether economic development, whether the impact of democracy is larger or smaller at higher levels of economic development. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on that now. Instead, I'm going to focus on three claims where I think the evidence gives us a stronger basis to make these claims. The first is that where democratic elections are more competitive, we see a greater increase in education spending. The second is that there's variation across different types of democratic electoral institutions, and specifically that where electoral institutions are more party-centered, we see an increase in the impact on education outcomes. And the third is that is variation across different aspects of ethnicity, and in particular, where there's higher levels of ethnic fractionalization or higher levels of the political salience of ethnicity, and these two things are distinct. In both cases, we see a reduction in the impact of democracy on education spending. So I'll talk first about competitiveness. So in this regard, there's some good evidence, I think, that the impact of democracy is larger where elections are more competitive. And here, this is the best evidence here is at the subnational level, so that should be taken into account. But there's some really nice findings from a subnational study in Mexico that suggest that a higher degree of electoral competition, measured as either kind of the number of legislative parties competing at the local level or the kind of the win margin of the mayor at the local level. Where elections are more competitive by those measures, we see a higher degree of education spending. Okay, so that implies that the kind of electoral competition and more competitiveness can lead to an increase in education spending, at least. I should mention here also, though, that there are various bits of evidence that suggest that elections can also increase education outcomes such as enrollment and literacy levels, even in less competitive contexts. So in some of my own work, I found that electoral competition, where we can kind of by different measures of kind of how competitive it is. So even say in contexts where elections haven't led to a turnover in power, for example, so might be taken to be less competitive, we still see an impact on access to primary education in sub-Saharan Africa, at least. And there's other findings that suggest that elections, even in electoral authoritarian contexts, compared to dictatorships that don't have any elections at all, can lead to an increase in education enrollment and literacy levels as well. Okay, The second thing I'll mention is variation across different types of electoral institutions. And here I think that the most interesting finding is that the impact of democracy in a way is greater where electoral institutions discourage the personal vote. Okay, so electoral systems can vary in different ways. And one way in which they can vary is by kind of encouraging candidate-centered or party-centered competition. And there's some really nice work from Hicken and Simmons that shows that where electoral systems are more candidate-centered, where they encourage the personal vote, we see less of an impact of increased education spending on education outcomes, or on a reduction in illiteracy levels. And so this relates to this ties back to the impact of democracy, because if democracy increases education spending, for that to be realized in terms of outcomes, it seems that there's variation in the extent to which that happens across electoral systems. So the graphs here are from this work by Hicken and Simmons, and what they show is across different aspects of electoral systems, each of which can encourage candidate-centered voting. So on each of these three graphs, a higher value on the x-axis means kind of a more candidate-centered party system. And what they're showing here is the marginal effect of an increase in education spending on illiteracy. And so at the lowest levels where we have party-centered electoral systems, we see a negative impact of education spending on illiteracy, but that reduction in illiteracy as a result of spending goes away as the electoral systems become more candidate-centered. Okay. And then the last thing I want to talk about at the country or administrative unit level is variation according to factors related to ethnicity. And so there's good evidence that the impact of democracy on social spending, of which education spending is just one part, that the effects of democracy are larger in countries where there are lower levels of ethnic fractionalization. And so some nice findings come from the work of Jensen and Scanning here, and this is where this graph is taken from. And what you can see, so we have variation in levels of ethnic fractionalization on the x-axis here. And at the lowest levels, we see this strong positive impact of democracy on social spending, but it's decreasing in levels of ethnic fractionalization and eventually disappears entirely. This ties into other findings, for example, from work by David Savage in sub-Saharan Africa, that actually the impact of democracy on education spending can also be reduced in contexts where there is more ethnic or regional voting. And so actually we see a bigger impact in places where ethnicity plays less of a part in vote choice, essentially. So where ethnicity is less salient for political competition. Okay. Then I want to move on. I don't want to take up too much time, but let me move on and talk about two particular interesting findings in terms of variation in the effect of democracy at the individual level. The first is that the effects of democracy are larger for individuals in lower or middle income groups. And the second, and perhaps related to this, is that the effects of democracy are larger for rural residents in sub-Saharan Africa, at least. There's also some interesting evidence about the impact of democracy on kind of co-ethnic bias. So there are findings that we see better education outcomes for people who are from the same ethnic group as the government or the president. There's some evidence that democracy can reduce that kind of co-ethnic bias, but I'm not going to talk about it here because, again, the findings are somewhat mixed, and so it's hard to be conclusive about that. But in terms of income, I think there's quite a lot of evidence now that the impact of democracy is larger for primary education spending than it is for spending on higher levels of education, like secondary and tertiary education levels. This has been shown globally, but also in regional studies looking at, for example, in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa. And this then ties into income because it's reasonable to think then that an increase in primary education spending is more beneficial for those at lower income levels who are less likely to already be accessing primary education than it is for those at the higher end of the income distribution who are likely to have a greater interest in increases in access to secondary and tertiary education. There's also evidence, again, from some of my own work here in sub-Saharan Africa, that the effects of democracy on education are largest for those in the middle income quintiles. This ties into my own work, which some work that Sirian mentioned in her presentation, where we argue that the impact of democracy on access to primary education works because it incentivizes governments to abolish primary school fees. And it's reasonable to imagine that the impact of abolishing primary school fees is lower for those for the richest individuals who are already likely to be able to pay primary school fees, and so who don't face a constraint in accessing education as a result of fees. It's also reasonable to imagine that actually it's less likely to have an effect for the poorest individuals who, even after fees have been abolished, may still face some other barriers to entry into education, even in the absence of official school fees. Okay, and then this ties into the last aspect that I want to talk about, which is variation according to urban-rural residents. And again, this comes from some of my own more recent work, in which what I show that the effects of democracy, although again, I see kind of these positive average effects of democracy on access to primary education in sub-Saharan Africa, when we differentiate between urban and rural residents, all of that effect is being driven by the impact for those in rural areas. And I see no significant effect of democracy on access to primary education for those living in urban areas. And then going beyond this, what I show is that this effect is conditional on the urban-rural distribution of the population at the national level. And so in these graphs, what you can see is that for rural residents, the positive impact of democracy on access to primary education is decreasing with levels of urbanization. Okay, and this is related to the incentives that governments face to kind of target resources towards rural areas in order to win the votes of the rural majority in many African countries. Okay, so let me just sum up then. So in response to this question of whether democracy improves education outcomes for everyone, I think my answer would be a very qualified yes, because I think there's good evidence that there's a lot of variation in the impact of democracy across a range of different factors. And so I feel reasonably comfortable concluding that democracy has a larger impact in places where elections are more competitive, where electoral institutions discourage the personal vote, and where there are lower levels of ethnic fractionalization or where ethnicity is less politically salient. And also that democracy has larger effects for those in the lower or middle income groups, and has larger effects for rural residents, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think this variation is important to understand because it has implications for how we might go about trying to maximize any educational dividends of democracy that we see from kind of these from the positive average effects of democracy from other studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robin, for providing all that wealth of research findings, also beyond what you have been involved with yourself. And let me just note for everyone listening, we hear again about the importance of the clean elections, the vertical accountability mechanism that it works, and it has positive effects also here on education. And I think for the policy practitioner community, also some good news in terms of that the effects of democracy on education are greater. You mentioned lower middle, although it's maybe strongest in the middle income quartile, rural areas, and for primary education. So they're exactly the kind of things and the stratas you want to try and do something about in poorer countries. So that's one of the take homes I took. And now we're going to move from education to women. And this is another important area of what democracy is supposed to be good for. And now we're going to learn from my esteemed colleague and friend and one of the early collaborators in the V-Dem project, Pamela Paxton. The floor is yours. Are you with us, Pam? Can we hear you?
Sorry, I was just getting my,
All right.
my thing set up. So thank you very much. I am delighted to be here as a part of this conference to talk about women's political empowerment and representation as a part of the case for democracy. So I have 3 takeaways that I hope that you take away from my brief presentation here today. The first is that women's representation, we can certainly think of it as a dividend of democracy, but I think we also need to remember that it is fundamental to democracy. Second, that we can think of democracy and women's representation as a virtuous circle. But more than that, it's an expanding virtuous circle that yields dividends to society at large. And finally, the third takeaway is that there are generational dividends that accrue to empowering women and girls. So if you ask anyone the definition of democracy, they're likely to mention representation as a key component. And certainly the idea that elites should represent the interests of all citizens is considered normatively good and a key piece of the case for democracy. At least since the end of World War II, it has been understood that women require formal representation, that women have the legal right to participate in politics on an equal basis with men. And so I'm actually going to pause here and say what I'm hoping to do in this presentation when I talk about the 3 takeaways is to link it to ideas of representation. I'm going to break representation down into several types of representation as a way of talking about these key takeaways. And I also want to point out that while I'm talking about women's representation, this applies, of course, to representation of all kinds. So back to formal representation. This is the idea that women have the legal right to participate in politics on an equal basis with men. We sometimes forget today that the fight for formal representation of women in politics was long, difficult, and occasionally bloody. But this fight is now basically over with women. We see women with formal representation around the world. But observation suggests that formal representation does not necessarily result in substantial numbers of women in positions of political power. In the last decades of the 20th century, therefore, feminist political theorists began to argue that a different conception of representation was needed, descriptive representation. This is the idea that we need to see a similarity between representatives and constituents. So if women make up about 50% of a population, they should be also making up about roughly 50% of legislative and executive bodies. The notion of descriptive representation hinges on the fact that racial and ethnic and gender groups are uniquely suited to represent themselves in democracies. In the case of women, they share a similar social position, having primary responsibility for child and elder care, and this leads them to have similar interests. So if we're to take representation seriously as an aspect of democracy, right, as a fundamental aspect of democracy, then women's representation and, of course, the representation of other groups is not just a dividend, right, but is fundamental to our notion of representation. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the next takeaway, that democracy and women's representation is an expanding virtuous circle. Now, certainly democracy can enhance women's representation. Now, I say can here because the research shows it's actually complicated. But certainly, and at least theoretically, we can understand that women should have more representation in democratic systems that aren't just rubber stamps. Women should be more adequately represented in countries where democratic processes are more firmly entrenched, and certainly where the rules of the political game are clear and consistent. It can help women see how they can work within the system to attain power. Now, what aspects of democracy are best for women? If we break democracy down into some of its essential components, some new research suggests that it's the expansion of civil liberties that are most linked to gains for women. So civil liberties like a free press or free speech are necessary for women's movements to be able to organize and to pressure governments for women's greater inclusion. So when we think about democratizing states, we should focus somewhat, on lots of things, but we need to focus, be sure to focus on civil liberties, as that can be important for women's full representation. We generally should be focused on bolstering women in democratizing states as well, because research shows that is a sensitive time where women often lose power, even if they were active in pushing for the democratic transition. So the other side of the virtuous circle is that women can improve democracy. And there's a number of pieces of evidence for this, but I just want to briefly talk about one very recent and interesting, excellent piece of research that shows that women's presence influences citizen perceptions of the legitimacy of political decision-making. So here, citizens viewed that political decisions made by gender-balanced committees were more fair, were more correct, and they felt that the committee and the legislatures and the related legislature could be better trusted to make good decisions. So this is when groups were gender balanced rather than made up of largely one gender. So we need to view this virtuous circle as expanding, however, expanding to produce dividends beyond the circle itself. What does women's representation in democracy result in? Well, certainly women have demonstrably different policy priorities than men. And there's growing evidence that women legislate differently. Women are more likely to focus on, to initiate, and to pass laws that serve women's and children's interests. They focus more on rape, on domestic violence, on women's and children's health, on childcare and child protection, and on poverty. A recent interesting piece of research looked at municipalities in Brazil that elected women mayors after a very close race with a man, and showed that those municipalities had better prenatal health outcomes compared to the municipalities where after this very close race, the man became mayor. So thinking about this virtuous circle and the expanding dividends that accrue to it means that we need to think and recognize substantive representation. This is the idea that women's interests are advocated in the political arena. So thinking about substantive representation helps us understand that higher numbers of women involved in politics is only a necessary but not sufficient condition for women's interests to be served. Women need to therefore be supported and their interests advocated for in order for us to see these dividends bear fruit. So finally, I want to turn to the third takeaway, that there are generational dividends to empowering women. And for this, I'm going to talk about a last concept of representation, which is symbolic representation. The focus here is on visibility and what that means, with visibility leading to a feeling among citizens of being fairly and effectively represented. And when there are more women visible in politics, it acts as a signal to women citizens that they are represented and that politics may be receptive to them. So certainly, we have seen that women's representation has benefits for women. Research shows that men interrupt women less in political meetings when more women are present. When women win high-profile political positions, it increases the proportion of women candidates for lower-level positions. And as the percentage of women in the legislature increases, women are more likely to talk about politics or to contact a member of parliament. We also see that having women leaders eliminates the negative view held by men about women's leaders' effectiveness. But symbolic representation matters particularly for girls. Visible women in politics increases girls' interest in politics. And not all effects are political either. In India, the educational and career aspirations of girls improve under a woman leader in remote rural villages. And the aspirations that parents hold for their daughters improves too, with parents more likely to support a daughter's choice of occupation. And we see that there are improved educational outcomes for girls when there are women leaders in these villages as well. In fact, after 2 cycles of a woman leader, the gap between boys and girls in educational outcomes was completely erased. So those are the 3 takeaways that I tried to get to in this short presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pam, and for that presentation, and thanks for joining us here today. We now have about 20 minutes for discussion and questions from the floor here present in Brussels, and also for all of you who are out there participating virtually. And should you want, who are virtual, should you want to come on in the webinar and ask your question live, we welcome you to do that as well. And let me just, for you in the room, you could just raise your hand so I see it, and we'll make sure a microphone gets your way. But let me start with reading a question from Valbona Karachi, or something along those lines. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. I think it's to Pam. Doesn't women's interests in certain areas deepen their stereotypes? Should we pressure them to contribute more on economic growth? Pam.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. It's and for I'm actually just going to start. It leads me into something that's really interesting, and I think that's important for us to think about, which is that it's difficult for us to assess what is women's interests, right? And so I think one of the issues that we have when we're trying to understand the effect of women in a variety of areas is that we've tended to think, most of the research has been largely in the West, and we sometimes take Western ideas about what a woman's interest should be, right? And so you can, and this comes partly from researchers taking a top-down perspective on what is a women's interest. So there's some very interesting research that attempts to take a more bottom-up perspective to what is women's interest, especially in non-Western areas. And so just to kind of circle back to the question, there's, if you, and actually talking about some of that research in India again, if you look at what women care about in these small rural villages, they're often very concerned with water projects. And if you look at what men are going to village councils about and asking about, it tends to be about roads. And what you can see is that women, when you have a woman leader in one of these villages, there tends to be more water projects. So it's not a typical way that in the West we might think of women's interest as linked to women's rights or child and elder care, but it's very relevant to the women there, and we do see kind of that link. So should we pressure women to correspond to something that we consider non-stereotypically women, a woman's interest? I don't think so. I think what we do need to do is think seriously about how to understand what women's interests really are in particular areas of the world or under particular contextual circumstances.
Thank you. Let me we have a few more questions in the Q&A. I'll bring them in, and now also requests from the floor. Let me take the prerogative as a chair and ask you, both Sirian and then Robin, questions. So for Sirian, the average effect you see for education quantity, but not for quality. What are your thoughts on whether the findings that Robin talked about, that it's greater towards sort of lower and lower middle income stratas, rural areas, and more on primary education, could that be an explanation for your finding? Question mark. And Robin, really, when you see all these results, some of which you have produced yourself and other studies that are related to the same area, and the I think very important findings that you reported, what is your message to the people working out there with education and with democracy support or protection these days, as one person in the room has forwarded or brought up earlier? So are there any short sort of guidance, if I'm not talking about maybe advice, but guidance that you see coming out of this? Sirian first.
Thanks for your question, Staffan. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, of course, as you point to, our study showed sort of the very aggregate result of how democracy relates to these measures of education quality. And as Robin mentioned, and this is also my reading of the literature, there's much more evidence that democracy has an effect on, especially when you look at enrollment and average years of education, that it has an effect on primary education. I think that's a pretty strong finding. In our study, so we look at both primary and secondary education. We also sort of broke this down and looked at the different subtypes separately, so looked separately at primary and secondary. And we didn't really find a big difference in our study, nor did we really find a big difference when it came to the income level of countries. So whether, let's say, in middle income countries, where there was where the democracy had more to say for education quality in this type of society. But of course, I mean, this is only one measure of education quality, and I'm pretty sure there are some heterogeneous relationships across type of democracies and type of income levels, type of, it's been pointed to type of education, perhaps. I think one thing that should be particularly relevant to this question of why education quality may be better in some democracies than others is the question of how politicians can be incentivized to want to invest in this. And I think factors that go into this equation of why a politician would want to invest in it. So, and that's also a question of why and how and when individuals will demand it are sort of certainly relevant to answer that.
Thank you. Robin, what do you say? Do you have any guidance?
Do I have any guidance? I mean, I think that there are lots of things that we could take from this. Let me follow from what Siriana said, actually, because I think her point about kind of aligning incentives of those who can make these changes, of politicians who are in control of these things, to actually do this, I think is key. And I think there are ways in which changes can be made and policies and institutions can be structured to better align these incentives. And I think some of these findings come through from the evidence that we have. So, there's evidence on, say, variation in electoral institutions, which arguably these kind of candidate-centered systems arguably have an effect because they alter efficiencies in public goods provision, but also because they can influence things like corruption, which can where there's greater corruption, we can have kind of slippages and loss of funds, so that increased spending doesn't translate into better actual learning outcomes. So that's one thing that we can think about institutional design, but it also relates to kind of the nature of electoral competition as well. So things like the encouragement of the personal vote, that connects to something that was talked about in the earlier panel about clientelism, and similarly might relate to ethnic voting as well. So where voting takes place along lines that are not based on holding politicians accountable for providing goods and services and delivering on the things that voters are demanding, then we're less likely to see a connection between electoral competition and the provision of goods and services that people demand. And so thinking about different ways to encourage accountability in that sense, I think are important things to be done in order to kind of maximize the benefits of democracy. And let me take this moment to tie into, there was a question from Julia Leininger on the Q&A that I think this connects to. So I'd be interested to know what Julia thinks about why this might vary with and without local elections. But I think, elections at the local level are an interesting thing here, because there's an idea that actually having kind of more accountability at a local level might increase the provision of goods and services by kind of maximizing the accountability connection here. Actually, in some recent work that I've been doing to look more at this, we've been exploring whether at the local level, greater kind of attribution of outcomes to the politicians who are responsible is likely to increase kind of voting along those lines. And actually the evidence that we're finding both in an experimental study run in Ghana and then also a match study run in India suggests actually that voters aren't more likely to vote along the lines of attributable outcomes, which raises questions about accountability and kind of then suggests that there may be more to be done in order to improve the quality of accountability to maximize these linkages between elections and the delivery of outcomes, at least at the local level. Anyway, sorry, that's a convoluted answer to the question, but the short answer is there's a lot that we can learn from this that can affect things on the ground and policies.
Yeah, with the local elections, obviously, it's also a question of what local assemblies can decide about and what kind of money they have versus what comes from higher ups and what's decided higher up, and that varies enormously, as we know. But so let me just rephrase this, Robin, and then you can say yes, hopefully, which is in today's world, in the practitioner's world, if you think about work at the embassies or missions or at the regional level, typically things like education is one box with one set of people working there trying to help with education. And then you have these crazy democracy support or protection guys on the other box. And what the research you present suggests is that they should talk to each other, because the effect of the effect of education support will be greater if, for example, the elections get cleaner. Yes.
So to the question of whether they should talk to each other, certainly yes. I think these things could be integrated, and that will lead to even better outcomes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We have a question from the floor. Yeah, please introduce yourself to everyone virtually attending as well.
Thanks, Stefan. Niels Weidmann, University of Konstanz. I have a question for Sirian and Robin about the role of private education, right? So how does this factor into the comparisons you have presented, right? Countries vary tremendously in the extent to which they permit or rely on private education at the different levels, right? Obviously, probably much more at the secondary and tertiary level. And is this something that sort of affects the relationship that we saw between a democracy and the provision of education? And so methodologically, wouldn't this be some sort of an unfair comparison in the sense that that if private education is what you measure in your outcomes, right, in the achievements at the country level, right, but which does not affect the educational budget, so sort of governments don't pay for it, right? Isn't that sort of an unfair comparison in the sense that we would have to take this into account because it varies so tremendously between countries?
Thank you. And Sirian, yes, and please a quick answer because I have another question for Pam that I want to also have room for.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that's a very good point. And often, education is just treated as one thing, while of course the factors that go into public versus private education should differ quite a lot. And I guess especially in a very rich democracy in particular, there will be excellent private education institutions, which make it look like democracies are doing even better when it comes to both education and sort of the achievements of students in these universities. But I think there's also quite a bit of variation in autocracies, or could be, between private and public institutions. So I think it varies a bit, but in many autocracies, you have excellent private institutions which can operate more freely from the government and may, for that reason, be able to promote even better education than public institutions. So I think you would see this variation in both autocracies and democracies, but I think it's an important question to look more into potential differences across these type of institutions, for sure. That's a short answer.
Thank you, and thank you, Sirian, for answering in a condensed form. So Pam, I guess you've seen in the chat there's a question from Nia Upadhyaya. Again, apologies for pronunciation. In your view, does having a woman prime minister or president have more or less impact than having more women in parliament? Sort of individual versus mass descriptive representation. And I guess you could broaden this even further. We talked about local elections and representation in other bodies as well. Sort of having many women at some sort of lower level or having one woman at the very top. What is more important?
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of points I want to make. Ultimately, I think the answer, sorry, is like, it depends, right? Kind of classic. But one thing I do want to point out, and to be clear, is that it is difficult often for us to disentangle or to distinguish women's impact from the surrounding context, like the political party that they belong to, right? Or whether a place where you might see better outcomes for women and more women in politics, is that the women affecting educational outcomes or health or something, or is it that there's similar things that are leading to both, right? But in terms of what we do know in research that is suggesting, that is kind of dealing with some of these problems, is that in both cases you can have an impact, and it a little bit comes down to, there's a distinction we can make between having a critical mass of women, right, in politics, in say in parliament, and does that make a difference, versus the critical acts of women, right, where a single, say, woman prime minister or president, and we really want to think about the entire executive here, because they can appoint a cabinet, right, and that can have an important role in various policies. And so I think it depends. Are we talking about substantive representation? Are we talking about symbolic representation? Certainly having a very highly visible prime minister or president who's a woman can have important symbolic consequences for women and girls. Their cabinet can certainly have important substantive outcomes, but so can women in parliament. And then at the local level, as well. So sorry, I can see we're almost out of time. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Sirian, for these important and great presentations and also the answering the questions. I think it's at least seems clear to me that these two goals that are part of the SDGs and in the Agenda 2030 on education and on empowering women and girls are in many ways at least interlinked with promoting and supporting and, if need be, protecting democracy, and not the least when it comes to ensuring some sort of vertical accountability. For women's representation, even maybe inseparable and in a virtuous circle, or then could be also vicious circle. I think we've seen much of the autocratization that's gone on in the last 20 years has also been linked with a reactionary agenda driven or cast in different clothes, if you like, but a reactionary agenda also for women's rights, women's empowerment, and for children's rights and development. So on that front, I think in all of these spheres, the scientific evidence that's provided is pretty clear in one direction rather than the other. On that note, let me say thank you not only to your speakers. We're really, really grateful and proud that you wanted to be with us here today. And I know all three of you wanted to actually be here, which but prevented for various reasons. And thank you also to everyone who has attended this online, virtually, and for asking your questions, and everybody here in the room. Let me say thank you, and we close it for the day. We're off.